Please, sir, I want some more.
What? 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 Ask for more?
If you look and listen hard enough, you begin to hear the ghosts of our Victorian past echoing through our popular culture. And often, that's been down to the outlook of the individuals who shaped it, or perhaps more accurately, manufactured it.
Today, most of us associate the name J. Arthur Rank with black and white films on wet Sunday afternoons. But you know, Rank wasn't actually a filmmaker. He was, in fact, a miller. But in the 1930s and 1940s, it was this unassuming Yorkshire miller who became the saviour of Britain's film industry.
For Rank, the very embodiment of the Victorian industrialist, the film industry was just that, an industry.
Rank saw culture as a commodity like any other, something that was manufactured, packaged and sold. His mills may have fed the nation, but he dreamed of giving people cultural sustenance, something to lift up their hearts and elevate their minds.
But there was an obstacle in the way of Rank's dream, and that obstacle was America. Before the Second World War, American films accounted for 80% of British screen time, earning $50 million a year from British cinema goers. But this wasn't just about the money.
In the summer of 1945, the head of Britain's new Arts Council, the economist John Maynard Keynes, made a radio address to the nation. And in it, he made no bones about his underlying ambitions.
Let every part of merry England be merry in its own way. Death to Hollywood.
Death to Hollywood. For people like Keynes, Britain's youngsters weren't just talking American.
If you think you're going to make a plowjacky out of me, you got another thing coming.
They were dressing American, walking American, even thinking American. And all this raised the ghastly prospect that very soon we would merely be a remote colonial outpost of a great American cultural empire.
Rank fervently believed that Britain had everything it needed to take on Hollywood and reassert good old British values. And at the end of the war, he proved it. In 1944, Rank brought Laurence Olivier's Henry V to the screen in glorious Technicolor.
Once more, unto the breach! Dear friends, once more, or close them all up with our English dead!
The story goes that Henry V was commissioned by Winston Churchill as a way of rallying the nation's morale for the long struggle against the Nazis. But the film also chimed perfectly with Rank's dream of packaging and selling patriotic high culture for a mass audience. And what better way to take on Hollywood than with the help of England's greatest playwright and Britain's finest actor?
And you, good yeomen, whose limbs were made in England, show us here the mettle of your pasture. Let us swear.
Henry V took the American box office by storm.
There is none of you so mean and base that hath not noble...
Time magazine called it one of the great experiences in the history of motion pictures.
The game's afoot. Follow your spirit, and upon this charge, try God for Harry! England and St. George!
This could have been Rank's own rallying cry, and it inspired some remarkably bull-headed rhetoric.
Another warmly appreciated speech came from that champion of British films, Mr. Rank.
As an exhibitor, I know today that you can make more money out of British pictures than any other pictures.
Strong words indeed, but Rank was convinced that the formula for success was to establish a quintessentially British brand, one which relied on British talent, British heritage and British history. And in the late 1940s, he bankrolled some of the greatest films ever made, from The Red Shoes and Great Expectations to A Matter of Life and Death.
But it is in connection with a film organization employing over 32,000 men and women that the name of J. Arthur Rank has achieved worldwide recognition, carrying the name of Britain to the farthest corners of the earth through the medium of British film.
But despite his successes, Rank himself never seemed entirely comfortable in the film world.
Even when Rank went to Hollywood, he remained very much the stoical Victorian industrialist. At one press conference in 1947, an American reporter was so frustrated by Rank's silence that he asked him, "Is it true, Mr. Rank, that you are dumb?" And there was a long pause. And then Rank said, "No, just dull."
Sadly, for all his efforts, this God-fearing Yorkshireman just couldn't compete with the vast Hollywood machine. But what he created was a formula that became one of the great mainstays of our post-war culture.
Above all, Rank had discovered that on the cultural front, Britishness and British history were our greatest assets. This would become our brand. And in the long run, it would fundamentally change not just how other people thought about us, but how we thought about ourselves.
This is BBC Television. It's 1 o'clock.
In 1964, the BBC's flagship sports programme Grandstand featured a rather unusual item.
Well, now, in just a few minutes, a Boeing 707 is due to arrive from New York and carrying in it 4 remarkable young men from Liverpool. And this is the moment they've been waiting for. Paul McCartney leading them off, George Harrison on the left, John Lennon at the back, Ringo Starr.
The Beatles were back from America, an international sensation.
But we told you you've come back from America millionaires.
No, I'm kidding. I'll buy you a drink.
But perhaps the way to understand the Beatles is not just as a band whose music has become the soundtrack to our lives, but as a business proposition. For all the vigour and freshness of the songwriting, the Beatles were an immaculately packaged product. And for that, they had one man in particular to thank.
Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager. Artists credit him with a unique judgment of what will be a hit and who will make it. Nearly all of them earn more than the Prime Minister.
Brian Epstein has become a near legendary figure, a Liverpool businessman who discovered the Beatles at the Cavern Club in 1961 and managed them until his early death in 1967.
I hadn't had anything to do with management of pop artists before. That day that I went down to the Cavern Club and heard the Beatles playing.
Having grown up working for his parents' furniture business, Epstein knew a thing or two about selling, and he knew exactly how he wanted to package the band.
The Beatles were then just 4 lads on that rather dimly lit stage, somewhat ill-clad, and the presentation was, well, left a little to be desired as far as I was concerned.
One of the first things that Brian Epstein did was to bring the Beatles to Liverpool's finest tailor. And there he replaced their black leather jackets with smart, dark suits. In essence, Epstein had turned them into the kind of band that your mother would approve of. But he was also making them a band, or a brand, that was quintessentially British. No longer did the Beatles look like 1950s American rockers. Now they projected a kind of sanitized, exaggerated Britishness.
It's been a hard day's night, and I've been working like a dog. It's been a hard day's night, I should be sleeping like a log.
wasn't just the suits. The Beatles were cheeky and irreverent. Lovable Liverpool jesters, not just serious musicians.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye, goodbye.
Well, you don't interview the Beatles, you just play straight men.
For an American audience, they'd seen something entirely new. Very quickly, Epstein's boys were generating enormous international sales. They made a rather refreshing change.
By the early 1960s, the world was turning its back on British exports. But the Beatles were bucking the trend. By 1967, they were making £20 million worth of export business from the United States alone.
George, how do you like being described as the Prime Minister's secret weapon?
Which is great, yeah. The thing is, I didn't get the bit where they said, earning all these dollars for Britain, or like, are we sharing it out or something?
The truth was, they were the Prime Minister's secret weapon. And in 1965, Downing Street showed its appreciation in a very public fashion.
So came the summons to the palace. The news got round to the faithful that the world's #1 group were to be invested by Her Majesty with the most excellent order of the British Empire.
But their MBEs weren't for music. The press claimed they were for money, for services to exports.
Baby's good to me, you know she's happy as can be, you know she said so. I'm in love with her and I feel fine.
This was an extraordinary moment. Today we take it for granted that pop stars and celebrities will be awarded MBEs almost every year. But in 1965, the Beatles Award felt genuinely shocking. For the first time, Britain's political establishment had recognised and rewarded pop cultural capital.
Why is the MBE awarded, though?
I don't know.
No idea.
In fact, you know, I know nothing about it. It's just that we've got it, and it's nice to have, and it doesn't make you more respectable or anything, I don't think. Maybe other people think it does. Doesn't make me any more respectable. I'm still a scruff.
The Beatles had been clutched to the bosom of the British establishment, and not everyone was happy about it. The pages of The Times simmered with outrage. For the next war, wrote one man, do not count on me, use the Beatles or the beatniks.
But amid all the invective, some correspondents grasped the deeper issues. Sir, may I list a few of the reasons why many people think the national recognition of the Beatles quite appropriate? 1. They are significant earners of foreign exchange. 2. They have, to quote Mr. Heath when he was president of the Board of Trade, saved the British corduroy industry. 3. They have helped to correct the foreign vision of Britain as a country entirely populated by middle-class conservatives of all sorts, e.g. stockbrokers, wildcat strikers, beef-eaters, and Pembrokeshire coracle fishermen.
By now, Britain's sense of its own identity seemed in flux. With our empire gone and our industry dying, here was a new role, entertainers to the world.
I think I'm gonna be sad. I think it's today. Yeah.
Every cultural revolution needs its founding texts. Preserved here in the Bodleian Library in Oxford is a document that arguably shaped modern Britain every bit as much as, well, the Magna Carta.
This is the very first Sunday Times colour section from the 4th of February 1962. Now today every Sunday paper has a colour supplement, but at the time this represented something thrillingly new, a glossy colour magazine carefully targeted at young, affluent and often female readers. So this very first cover features the model of the moment, Jean Shrimpton.
Just your eyes I'm interested in now. Good.
Well, no one told me about her.
Wearing clothes by Mary Quant, photographed by David Bailey.
Make that, let me, no, David, who told you to move?
And there's even the promise of a new James Bond story by Ian Fleming himself. Something for everyone.
Why should I care?
And everyone, it seemed, rather liked it.
She's not there. Well, let me tell you about.
Within 9 months, the Sunday Times had 200,000 extra readers. And by 1964, the Sunday Telegraph and the Observer had launched colour supplements of their own. And in these glossy pages, you could read about the latest British fashions, the latest British film stars, the latest British pop groups. Aspirational, materialistic, and heavily funded by advertising, these glossy magazines played a central role in creating the idea of the swinging 60s, and more specifically, of swinging London.
They seek him here, they seek him there. His clothes are loud, but never square.
If you read enough of these magazines, you might imagine that London was a buzzing Technicolor metropolis.
'Cause he's a dedicated follower of fashion.
A city inhabited solely by artists, pop stars, and models.
Round the boutiques of London town,
But in truth, it wasn't quite like that.
pursuing all the latest fads and trends. 'Cause he's a dedicated follower of fashion.
In 1968, almost a quarter of London's households were living in poverty. This was still, above all, a working industrial city.
In reality, you know, the 60s only swung for a tiny minority. Of course, life was getting better, but even here in London, that was more a question of cars, fridges, and washing machines than of free love and flower power. Less Magical Mystery Tour, more Coronation Street. But in a sense, that didn't really matter. Swinging London was about the triumph of image. And this was the key moment when Britain's image changed from grey industrial powerhouse to Technicolor global entertainers.
Save me, somebody save me.
Swinging London may have been little more than a branding exercise to disguise our post-war decline, but it worked. What it created was a new image of Britain, both at home and abroad, an image of London as the capital of culture and of Britain, once again, as a place of consequence.
The swinging London phenomenon reached its peak with this, the April 1966 edition of the American magazine Time. Inside, in admittedly fairly excruciating prose, the magazine painted a picture of a city devoted to high fashion, pop culture, and the pursuit of pleasure. Here's an extract. This spring, as never before in modern times, London is switched on. The city is alive with birds, girls, and Beatles, buzzing with mini-cars and telestars, pulsing with half a dozen separate veins of excitement.
The tourists came in their droves. In 1960, some 1.5 million people had visited London, but by the mid-60s, that figure was more like 6 million. And London was now exporting the idea of its swinging scene all over the world.
Caracas, the swinging city of Venezuela. The Centro Comercial Chacatio building is the place for mod gear. The influence is definitely Carnaby Street. Boutiques abound, crammed with pace-setting clobber, hot from the fashion centre in London W1.
Only a few years earlier, Britain had still been one of the world's great exporters of steel and ships. Now we were selling fashion and music. And like our old industrial exports, these things were often made in our manufacturing heartlands and brought to London before being sold abroad. Victorian London had been the world's capital of money, but 60s London saw itself as the capital of culture.
But for one young entrepreneur, it was precisely our Victorian legacy that offered the greatest cultural possibilities. After all, Britain still had a rich network of global connections, the threads of empire. And while his predecessors had been trading slaves and sugar, his chosen commodity was culture.
Keep on running, keep on hiding. One fine day I'm gonna be the one to make you understand.
In the early 1960s, this corner of West London, then neglected and shabby, was home to much of the city's growing West Indian community.
The spectacle of a 25-year-old former public schoolboy driving around these streets in a Mini Cooper might have seemed a bit incongruous. But the man in the Mini was one of the most remarkable cultural entrepreneurs in our modern history. His name was Chris Blackwell, and he'd grown up in Jamaica and fallen in love with the local music. And he was here in London to sell ska music to the Jamaican immigrant community. And he kept the records in the boot.
Like all great entrepreneurs, Blackwell had identified a market.
Any moment now, there's going to be a fierce outbreak of ska. And ska is the new beat from the West Indies, from Jamaica.
Where the Victorians had imported Jamaican sugar, Chris Blackwell was going to import Jamaican music. And he did so with remarkable success.
Daylight come and I want to go home, but all they want to do is ska.
His first hit came from the 17-year-old Millie Small with the single My Boy Lollipop. Blackwell's label, Island Records, quickly became one of the most exciting around, with a remarkable roster of talent. But Blackwell always dreamed of propelling Jamaican music into the mainstream, and in the early 1970s, he got his chance.
By 1970, Blackwell had set up a recording studio here at Basing Street, West London. This room, believe it or not, was his office. And it was through that door that in 1972, Bob Marley and the Wailers came strolling in for their first meeting with the man who would make them famous. They made such an impression that Blackwell gave them £4,000 then and there to go away and make a record. Now, some of his friends were worried that he'd never see the money or indeed the band ever again, but Blackwell's hunch would pay handsome dividends.
A couple of months later, Blackwell was invited to the studio to hear what would become Marley's first album for Ireland, Catch a Fire.
Up until this point, reggae was still very much a minority interest. But Blackwell was convinced that Bob Marley could take it into the musical mainstream. To do that, though, Blackwell felt they needed to make the music more accessible for a British audience. So he deliberately toned down the frenetic reggae style. He introduced more guitars and more synthesizers. He even expanded the solos. And the result was one of the most influential records in rock music history.
Catch a Fire was released to enormous acclaim. It kick-started Marley's career.
Since I've got you on my mind.
But Blackwell had one more trick up his sleeve.
Chris Blackwell always had a real flair for marketing, and in particular he was a great believer in packaging. If people thought something looked good on the outside, he once said, then they would naturally assume there must be something good on the inside. And that's certainly true of Catch a Fire. So the album is designed like a Zippo lighter. You flick it open, you get the fire, and ultimately the vinyl. To be completely honest, it is actually a bit of a hassle getting the record in and out, but that I suppose is beside the point, because in the early 1970s this seemed like a thing of beauty, and let's be honest, it is a lot better looking than an iTunes download.
The combination of Bob Marley's talent and charisma and Chris Blackwell's entrepreneurial nous turned the reggae artist into a global superstar.
Island Records have invested several $100,000 in Bob Marley and the Wailers, and the dividend just keeps on increasing.
Legend, The Best of Bob Marley, went on to sell 25 million copies, becoming one of the best-selling albums of all time.
Reggae is now firmly established as a highly marketable commodity heard throughout the world, perhaps the only really new sound of the 70s.
All this could, I think, only have happened in Britain. You see, in essence, what Blackwell was doing was capitalising on the long-established relationship between the imperial metropolis, London, and its former colony, Jamaica. Only this time, the key commodity wasn't sugar, it was music. Whatever you might think of the empire, the fact is that it left Britain at the centre of a dense web of cultural and economic connections. And it was this network that Blackwell used to bring reggae to a global audience.
The influence of reggae can still be heard to this day, and the deeper tones of Jamaican dub and dancehall have inspired British music movements from drum and bass to dubstep and grime.
Look at me up in the cheeky man. Look up with the drama we started. Now I'm in here laying on my back, singing DJ, what you give me one more track.
But of course, not everybody's musical tastes are quite so cool and urban.
When we think about the music of the 60s and 70s, we often think about the big names. People like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, David Bowie and the Sex Pistols. But the reality was a bit more surprising. The best-selling act of the 1960s, for example, wasn't the Beatles. It was Soundtrack, featuring original cast.
Raindrops on roses and whiskers on